All right, malaria is another disease that we will talk about this week, and it is a major disease. As you can see from this figure here, there is what's called the malaria belt, where very close to the equator, regardless of where on the earth you are, there is a high prevalence of malaria. So what we're going to hopefully learn about in this short lecture on malaria are the causative agents, looking at the genus and the different species that cause it and which one is worse and why. Hopefully you will understand the life cycle. This is caused by an organism. Yes, it's caused by an organism, but it is caused by a protozoan. So that's really the answer to objective number 5. And it goes through the body, gets into the body, and it's able to actually hide. And so we'll just talk about all of these different components of malaria. So it's caused by Plasmodium. This is a genus of protozoan, and there are 4 different species that cause it. So there's Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium falciparum, and Plasmodium ovale. All of these show a different pattern and severity in disease, and the reason for this is basically because the specific species, the protozoan, is actually able to infect different life stages of the red blood cell. All right, so we'll talk about that in a couple of slides, but the development of Plasmodium is divided into 2 distinct phases because there is an asexual phase that is going to be carried out in the human, and then there's a sexual phase that's carried out in the mosquito. And hopefully you all are aware of, just because of common news, that the malaria organism is going to be spread by mosquitoes. So a person doesn't get it from human to human transmission, but rather the mosquito gets it, bites the human, and infects the human that way. And then if another mosquito that doesn't have the protozoan comes and takes a blood meal from a human that is infected, then the protozoan is able to, the life cycle is able to continue. So the signs and symptoms, there's generally a 10-day incubation period, with the first symptoms being very vague and sometimes mild. There's malaise, there's fatigue, vague aches, and there's generally nausea that can sometimes have or will not have diarrhea. Then the more severe symptoms are going to be the chills, the fever, and the sweating, usually night sweats, and these symptoms occur at 48 to 72 hour intervals. And this is a result of what's called synchronous red blood cell rupture. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at the figure. So, the interval, the length, the regularity of the symptoms reflects the type of malaria. With falciparum malaria, there is a persistent fever. And sometimes there can be a cough and weakness that persists for weeks, so you don't always get that break with that 48 to 72 hour intervals of time. So complications can occur, but they're generally going to be from the Plasmodium falciparum, and that is because, or due to, hemolytic anemia. So Plasmodium falciparum is able to infect every type, every phase of red blood cell development, from the very early immature red blood cells to the very mature red blood cells. So no red blood cell is safe from that organism. Unlike some of the other species, they're only able to infect certain kinds. So if all of the mature red blood cells are killed off because of the organism, well, the mature or the immature ones are still able to mature and hopefully do their job for a little bit before they get infected. But with the falciparum, that infects all of the red blood cells and can likely result in all of your red blood cells being lysed. And so this also will develop organ enlargement because the red blood cells will lyse, and all of them will lyse, and so you have a lot of cellular debris that accumulates specifically in the spleen, the liver, and the kidneys. Why? Because these are organs that are going to actively work to filter the blood. And because there's so much cellular debris, because of the organism, the amount of the organism, and then just the plasma membrane of the red blood cells and all of the organelles inside of the cells that are breaking, there's just a lot of debris. And so you can have inflammation, not just inflammation, but just flat out organ enlargement of spleen, liver, and kidneys. All right, another complication of falciparum malaria is cerebral malaria. And unfortunately, this is a very, very severe complication. And this occurs when small blood vessels in the brain become obstructed due to the red blood cells, and then they block the route of the blood. It could be completely causing strokes, or it could just be down to 50%, and that just decreases the oxygen that's getting to the brain, can cause coma and eventually death. Now, it's interesting, why do those red blood cells adhere to blood vessel walls? Well, it's a response to the malaria organism being inside of it. They express slightly different proteins on the surface of the cell, and those just are sticky. And so it's not as big of an issue in the bigger blood vessels where there's more pressure and more movement, faster force. But in the very small blood vessels of the brain, there's not as much force, it's not as big. And so even though all of the red blood cells can be sticky, or a little extra sticky, you don't see the effect in other areas of the body as you do in the brain. Alright, so here's table 18.1, and it looks at all of the different stages or the life cycles of the Plasmodium organism. So to begin with, you've got the mosquito in step 1, and the sexual phase has just finished in the mosquito, and at this phase the organism is classified as being a sporozoid. So the sporozoid is actually what gets injected into the human at the level of the skin, and almost immediately the organism somehow is able to very specifically move to the liver. And it does this simply by blood movement, and when the blood gets to the liver for the filtering process, the organism, the sporozoids are able to stick to the hepatocytes, get into the hepatocytes, and then they alter themselves to become merozoites. Alright, so sporozoid in the mosquito gets into the human, goes to the liver, transforms into the merozoid. Then, once in the merozoid, once the merozoid has formed, then the merozoid is then able to infect the red blood cell, and then once in the red blood cell, the merozoid turns into a trophozoid. So then the cycle just continues. Merozoids will continue to infect liver cells and also red blood cells, and then the merozoids and then the trophozoids are able to infect the red blood cell. And as these organisms are released into the open blood, that is that cycle that you see, where the fever, the chills. The fever and the chills are going to be caused by the immune system responding to the foreign material, the protozoans that are in the blood. And then once they get back into new red blood cells, then they're hidden. So liver cells and red blood cells are where the organism goes inside the body to hide from the immune system. Then in some cases, within the red blood cell, the merozoites will transform into gametocytes. And so at this point, that's when the process transitions from the asexual back toward the sexual phase. And then once the mosquito comes and takes a blood meal from this person, if they pull in red blood cells that have the gametocytes in it, then the sexual cycle of the organism can continue within the mosquito, and then it just continues back. So, sexual phase in the mosquito, asexual phase in the humans. You transform, so to speak, from the sporozoite to the merozoite to the trophozoite / gametocyte, and the gametocyte is what goes back into the mosquito to transform into the sporozoite. Alright, so really we've talked about most of this, about how the pathogenicity of the organism is the fact that it is able to invade the red blood cells. And that leads to the release of fever-inducing chemicals into the bloodstream, causes that cycle of chills and fever. Another interesting part of malaria is that the organism is actually able to metabolize glucose at a very high rate. And so this is blood glucose, because the organism is in the blood and in the liver. And that leads to hypoglycemia in the human host who isn't seeking treatment. So the damage to the red blood cells results in anemia, and then you have the liver enlargement that can be problematic. Alright, and then the last slide is just the nice summary table that you have in your text with the different 4 species of organisms. Alright, the most common mode of transmission is the mosquito to be a biological vector, and the vertical transmission is the fact that the organism can cross the placenta, and so then it can be passed from mother to infant. The virulence factors, the fact that the organism can have multiple life stages and multiple antigenic types. So is it likely to find a vaccine? It's problematic because there's so many different antigens that the organism can display that it's hard to create an effective vaccine. How do you diagnose it? You can actually look at a blood smear. Alright, just draw red blood cells out and look at them on a microscope, and you can see the organism inside the red blood cells. It's actually how large they can be. And then prevention is going to be mosquito control, really. And treatment can be hard because there is drug resistance. And again, the organism changes what it looks like and what it does. So that's another way it can develop resistance. And also, it's just difficult for those who are most affected by malaria along the equator belt, or along the equator at the malaria belt, to actually be able to have access to proper treatment, both from the financial standpoint as well as just the, I'm blanking here, the logistical components as well.